All right, so we might begin for this session. So for this session, the paper's title is Beyond Sydney, Colonial-Era Crime Reporting in Regional New South Wales. The presenter we have today for this session is Rachel Franks. Thank you, Rachel. Rachel is the Coordinator Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales and an Honorary Associate Lecturer at the University of Newcastle. Rachel holds PhDs in Australian crime fiction at Central Queanbeyan Uni and true crime texts at Sydney Uni. An award-winning writer, Rachel's book about Sydney-based hangman Robert, is it Nosy Bob Howard? Will be published, in 2022, so next year.
Yep, the manuscript went in on Monday.
Right. Well, best of luck with that, and best of luck with your presentation today.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I would like to begin by acknowledging that this paper was written and is being presented today on Gadigal land, the place now known as Sydney. So this is very much an accidental paper. It is also very niche and it comes with really bad slides. So in researching judicial hangings in New South Wales over the 19th century, I had thought that all of the relevant details for these felonious dispatches would be found conveniently co-located in the Sydney Morning Herald. For the who, what, when and where, and also sometimes the why of colonial-era crime cases, it makes sense to turn to the colony's newspaper of record, which routinely reported facts and generally conservative opinions on crime and crime control since its inception in 1831. Executions until the phasing out of the death penalty in Australia were covered as a matter of routine. Now, in a surprise twist in my research, some of the standard details of hanging, even those that brought a dramatic conclusion to a high-profile crime case, are not actually found in the Herald. Indeed, some secondary sources will specify not in SMH, as though that's the end of the matter. Another key text is the Sydney-based Evening News, a newspaper more outspoken than some of its competitors and rarely hesitated to criticise authorities when reporting on crime, most obviously in the late 1870s when it was quick to condemn the death penalty. From the Herald, the Evening News, and through to other Sydney newspapers such as Truth and Freeman's Journal, it is possible to rebuild many of the minor and major criminal cases that were considered newsworthy across the 19th century, and increasingly so towards the end of the century when, as the decades passed, you have literacy rates obviously increasing, more column space becomes available as well. Yet some of the detailed and more emotive accounts of crimes and their punishments that captured society's attention in the years before Federation appeared in regional mastheads. So this paper looks very briefly at how, for researchers reviewing crimes committed in New South Wales over the 1800s, regional publications can supplement and in some instances actually replace some of the more obvious mastheads that are available in Trove. Of course, there are numerous sources beyond newspapers for those investigating our criminal past. Yet for the final chapter of any narrative of crime, the chapter of punishment, newspapers are often the most easily accessible records that give us a story and not just a set of facts. So, for example, certificates of execution in New South Wales are frustratingly brief. And you can see from this example up on the screen, the rather unfortunately named George Rope, it really is name, date, jail yard, and the names of the official witnesses. So the role of newspapers in describing the ends of felons of all types became even more crucial in New South Wales after the implementation of the Act to regulate the execution of criminals, 1855. First introduced in 1853, this new law stipulated the end to public displays of state-sanctioned violence. The scaffold was no longer open access. And as Stephen Anderson has noted, accounts of executions in in newspapers became the dominant medium through which the death of the criminal could be understood by the public. For historians, there is also the potential to see patterns in reportage and shifts in public sentiments towards crime, and for the purposes of this research, shifts in how we thought about and talked about the ultimate sentence of the law. There are, of course, lots of variables that need to be taken into consideration when reading reports on hangings. Editors could be naturally conservative and keen to ensure that executions were not sensationalised. Some journalists were really abolitionists who had a convenient vehicle for their opinions. Circulation also mattered, as did the victims. The press, as you would all know, has a long history of positioning crimes against the young, the vulnerable, the pretty, and the usually white as crimes of the very worst type. This is, in essence, a big data project, but what I'm trying to offer today are what I hope are some useful examples for talking about regional newspapers in crime reporting. So my first example is the Bathurst Free Press. Now, spoiler alert, nothing is straightforward, as you'll see from the coverage of, or not, of two particular executions that I'll talk briefly about now. So the Bathurst Free Press was one of several newspapers that reported on the hanging of Thomas Kelly, who was sent off in 1872 at Darlinghurst Jail. So Kelly had been incarcerated at Parramatta Jail. He was working in a yard, and one of the superintendents, William McLaren, asked him to cut pieces of sandstone into smaller pieces. Kelly took offence, he picked up a stonemason's hammer and he bashed the superintendent in the head. He was convicted of attempted murder and he was sentenced to death, which is kind of routine even up into the 1870s. Kelly's day came and he decided he was not going to cooperate with the hangman John Bull or his assistant John Franks. Kelly cried out, "I'll not be hung, I do not deserve it." He then attacked the hangman. Now, multiple articles suggest that there was a bit of a scuffle, but really nothing too serious. Bull had been assaulted and he was replaced by his assistant. The Herald stated Bull had been kicked violently in the stomach. This was actually repeated verbatim in the Bathurst Free Press. Now, Kelly's religious counsellor on the day, Reverend Carroll, wrote to the Herald and he complained that they had actually misrepresented Kelly's preparations for death, and instead of minimising the incident, which they had done, he suggested the whole affair had been sensationalised and that the scene at Darlinghurst was solely attributable to an ungovernable fit of excitement brought on by the occasion and circumstances. Now, Truth, in its usual fine form, clarified what happened a few years later. The condemned man turned sharply round and, raising his right foot, planted a terrific kick in the part of Bull's anatomy which must not be mentioned to ears polite. Suffice that the kick delivered straight in front completely doubled up the hangman, who straightway retired and could not be induced to reappear. Now, emphasising the true violence witnessed but underreported that day is the fact that Bull never recovered from Kelly's kick. So he sees off 3 more murderers at the gallows. He's then institutionalised and he dies from his injuries in 1873, less than 18 months, after he was assaulted. Now, downplaying such events was not uncommon. Journalists played a crucial role in upholding the legitimacy of a hanging. As Tim Castle has written, the careful management of the execution ceremonies was essential to ensure that the use of violence by the state was seen as the culmination and fulfilment of the ordinary legal process. Now, returning to the point that nothing is straightforward, copying and pasting was certainly common across colonial newspapers, but there could be huge differences in reportage. So when Timothy Sullivan was tried for the murder of Daniel Harrington back in 1852, the Herald offered a fulsome account of the trial and Sullivan's guilty verdict, but no specifics of the double hanging of Sullivan and a Chinese man named Newing. In sharp contrast, the Bathurst Free Press was very happy to fill the void. They wrote, The sudden jerk of Sullivan's vast weight, aided by the length of the fall, caused the rope to separate the carotid artery. The blood gushed the ground in streams and splashed the Chinaman as he hung by his side. The jail wall and door were also plentifully besmeared, and the lid of the coffin was almost covered in the crimson fluid. A ghastly sight now presented itself. The fleshy portion of the neck, together with the windpipe, was completely cut through, and the body, almost severed by the head, was suspended by the spine and back tendons. Now, readers are assured that Sullivan died without struggle, which is technically correct. But importantly, the Bathurst Free Press goes on to state, apart from all question about capital punishment, such a scene is simply revolting. Now, in a disturbing postscript, Sullivan's last request was to be buried with his murder victim. It was reported that Harrington's coffin had been disinterred to allow this to happen. Now, while requests for last meals were routinely shared with the public, Sullivan's macabre wish was likely something authorities would have preferred to keep quiet. Now, some of the details in newspaper reports on judicial murder might sound trivial or unnecessarily ghoulish. They are, however, critical to working out if a prisoner suffered unnecessarily or not. Hanging is obviously a terrible way to die, but some hangings were more prolonged than others. In supporting the policy of the death penalty, newspaper editors often had no qualms in turning down the odd bungled job here and there. Now, to modernise judicial murder and make executions more transparent, as well as bring New South Wales in line with other colonies, the Act to consolidate and amend in certain respects the criminal law, 1883, dictated that coroners would, as soon as practical, hold an inquest upon the body of the executed person, and the jury on such inquest shall inquire and find whether the sentence was duly carried into execution. Now, inquests on hanged felons was not unheard of, but this legislation certainly stipulated that it had to happen as a matter of routine. So regarding inquests, regional newspapers such as the Queanbeyan Age often delivered interesting variations on a standard inquest was held and the jury returned the usual verdict. For example, when Robert Hewitt was hanged for murder in 1888 at Darlinghurst, the Queanbeyan Age wrote how the jail surgeon had certified that the hanging had been fatally effective. Now, like any newspaper, facts and figures must be questioned. The Queanbeyan Age published an account of the end of John Slay, a murderer hanged at Goulburn in 1900. Death was absolutely instantaneous, not a tremor appearing after the body had fallen. The executioner had allowed a drop of about 13 feet. After remaining suspended for some 20 minutes, the body was removed to the morgue to wait the inquest. Now, 13 feet is a ridiculous drop and quite unbelievable. So it's much more likely that Slay fell 7, maybe 8 feet for a long drop. But these drops are critical to understanding the death penalty, with coverage of executions also revealing patterns of racism. So it seems like macabre or quite ghoulish detail to say how far someone fell, but you are much more likely to have your drop reported in the press if you are white. So to add a bit of contrast, the Queanbeyan Age actually took the side of a murderer in 1883. A sentence of death was handed down at the conclusion of a murder trial, and the judge said that he hoped a wise and merciful executive would remit the sentence of an 18-year-old girl. So the story is picked up by a Victorian regional newspaper, the North Eastern Ensign. They wrote, "The Executive Council of New South Wales, having considered the case of Milbra Knott, the young girl who was found guilty of the murder of her lover, Robert Mitchell, at the Armidale Assizes, have commuted the death sentence to one of just 5 years imprisonment." Public sympathy had expressed itself strongly in the favour of the prisoner, who had been greatly provoked and exasperated by the refusal of Mitchell to marry her after promising to do so. Now, when a particularly remorseful murderer was hanged in regional New South Wales in 1889, there was so much attention paid to the penitence of the prisoner, there was actually very little coverage about his execution. The Sydney Morning Herald managed a one-liner. Thomas Riley was executed at Wagga yesterday morning, with a couple of follow-up paragraphs, on this occasion a copy and paste from regional colleagues, buried into colonial news. And I think the genealogy of individual crime articles across multiple newspapers is fascinating, but a question for another day. So the Goulburn Evening Penny Post gave a detailed report on what happened around the gallows. Now, as noted at this point in the 19th century, the laws around who could and could not watch a hanging were quite different to audiences that gathered from 1788 and through to the mid to early 19th century. It was stipulated in the new legislation that a medical officer had to be present at an execution to state that the hanging had been carried out as ordered and the right person had been sent off. Lots of conspiracy theories about not hanging anyone or hanging someone else instead. Now, one of the advantages of the new system was that it put an end to felons needing to hang the usual time, usually an hour after being dropped, and medical officers could declare life extinct within minutes of the bolt being drawn. Now, on this occasion, Erasmus Wren, a great name, the jail surgeon, was tardy, so the hanging did not take place at the scheduled time of 9 a.m. Now, this information is of great value because it destabilises the idea of the perfect procession for an execution and how authorities had complete control over these events of death. We can learn from the Government Gazette in New South Wales the Government Gazette of New South Wales, in advertiser mode, that there were 15 official witnesses, while the Goulburn Evening Penny Post also explains that a small crowd gathered outside the walls of the jail, even though the hanging was completely private. Now, Riley, in trying circumstances, managed to maintain his profile as the perfect prisoner. He was firm and bore up remarkably well, and he did not evince the least sign of fear. He acknowledged those who had come to watch. He looked over the jail walls and up at the sky, but he focused his attention on the two priests accompanying him in his last moments. The hangman did his work quickly, and the executioner gave the signal, the bolt was drawn, and Riley disappeared a drop of about 9 feet. The noose was made up of a rope from around 3.5 inches in circumference, which is much thicker than the usual cord. These details also give us a sense of Riley's celebrity status. So he's actually a cousin of notorious bushrangers Dan and Ned Kelly. So death was euphemistically, at least, instant, although it was reported a groan could be heard and some blood stained the white execution cap. Again, are these details necessary? Do they merely serve to reinforce our fascination with the criminal rather than heighten our sympathy for the victim? In Riley's case, the murder of his employer, Christian Eppel, cut down a much-loved man while also depriving Mrs. Eppel and 4 children of their primary caregiver. Now, much more literate than his cousin's Jerilderie letter, Riley penned a note which was published in the Daily Telegraph. I must ask you now, Mrs. Eppel, to forgive me for my unmanliness of forethought in giving way to the vile temptations of the devil. I have told my brother to see you as soon as he could and to help you in your trouble. He will do so and remain a good friend to you. I hope you will not refuse his assistance, as it would be of a great consolation to me to know that you are not altogether deserted or forsaken. And may the God Almighty pour his blessing on you and protect you and help you and your family in your trouble through life. And I hope that he will repair the injury I have done to you. So crime stories usually focus on punishment, but they can also, on rare instances, focus on regret. This in turn forces us to confront ideas over punishment and particularly over punishment. So in this example, Riley was obviously incredibly remorseful, and would life incarceration have actually been a more appropriate social and judicial response rather than hanging to this young man's wrongdoing? So to conclude, newspapers of regional New South Wales often offer rich reportage. Through several short case studies of high-profile crime stories, this brief sample of research, I hope, demonstrates the value of regional newspapers for historians investigating criminals and their victims. Too often, I see in secondary sources, smaller mastheads are ignored, and investigations of past crimes and our reactions to criminal acts are lesser because of that. Now, that said, the approach of the Sydney Morning Herald, which, as I've mentioned, often downplayed, but could be emotional on occasion, was a usually animated advocate of capital punishment. But when they offer the odd understatement, it can be incredibly powerful. For example, the Herald voiced much surprise at the decision of the Executive Council to withhold mercy in an 1880 case. Albert, an Aboriginal man found guilty of murder that was very likely a case of self-defence, was scheduled to hang in Dubbo. The paper of record, in a rare criticism of the government at the time, stated the execution of Albert is a great mistake. As executions shifted behind jail walls, the roles of newspapermen in advocating for, or at least acknowledging the value of, capital punishment became more and more important to authorities keen on still communicating displays of justice, and more important to historians unpacking changing practices and, importantly, our views around the death penalty. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Are there any questions? If everyone wants to turn their mics on, their cameras on, you're more than welcome.
I'll ask one. Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel. Absolutely fascinating and lovely to see you. Your hair has grown since I saw you last.
Yeah, I need a lockdown haircut. I think it's week 14 for me.
Me too. Yeah, fascinating. Just interested though, what the sense that you got the regional newspapers in their coverage. Was this syndicated material from other newspapers, or had they had reporters there?
Look, I did try and start unravelling the family history of where all these came from. So the Bathurst Free Press article that I quoted from today was first printed in the Bathurst Free Press. But then you see it syndicated later in other regional newspapers. Interestingly, the Goulburn Evening Penny Post article about Thomas Riley is then picked up. That's the copy and paste in the Sydney Morning Herald a day or so later. They sort of say, oh, from our correspondent. Some of them are a bit clearer, as you would know. You know more about this than I do. They're quite good at acknowledging who they've taken stuff from. But that's why I think it's possibly a big data project, because it would be quite interesting to unpack and then sort of who republishes who, you know, and yeah, like Freeman's Journal, they write an absolutely bonkers description of a hanging. And I think from the early work that I've done, they will actually sort through, and a few days later, up to a week later, they will republish the most flamboyant description, which is kind of great if this is your thing. It's pretty grim, but I think it's important to reflect on how terrible we can be and how open we can be about that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Margaret.
I could keep talking to you for a long time. I'll be good.
Any other questions?
Sorry, Marcus.
Yeah, go for
not
it.
so much a question as a sort of comment about the cut and paste thing. I don't know whether you know, but there's been some work done on this sort of thing in Britain, particularly Melody Beales at Loughborough has done a lot on cut and paste using digital technology and things, you know, that sort of thing. So I'd say, yeah, it might be an interesting project to take up. She's been looking at cut and paste between New Zealand, Australia, and British newspapers. But this might be So there are people working on that area, and this is a particularly interesting topic to take up.
I think it's fascinating, and I think that be able to sort of picture quite clearly some relationships, and depending on how much data you could put into the back end, squabbles between editors, and if they switch from taking from one masthead to another, do they follow favourite editors and journalists? Yeah, there's a lot to do there.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, Robert.
Yep. The predictable question for me, Rachel, are the stories ever illustrated, and if so, how?
Oh, that's a great question, and they become increasingly illustrated, kind of basic. Truth would have some of the best illustrations. I have not seen any that I can recall in the regional newspapers. But it's interesting how Truth will privilege certain topics over others. Obviously, the Bulletin has some incredibly beautiful, if you can use that description, illustrations of gallows and some quite heinous interpretations of hangman and that sort of thing. But yeah, looking at the illustrations in Truth over time, so focusing on Nosy Bob, it's almost like they become more respectful of the hangman. You know, he's sort of, there's one series where you have all these felons and they kind of all look the same, but he is drawn in a much more particular way, and he has a hat like a gentleman, you know, like it's, yeah, it's interesting. I need to print them all off and pester you when you make it to Sydney, ask you what you think.
Good-o.
Any other questions? No? I love the fact that we now have the opportunity with the digitized content to actually start creating and exploring these projects. When I've spoken to others outside the field and you start talking about, I'm doing some research on history, and they're like, well, hasn't changed, has it? But we've got access to so much, I think, through platforms like Trove and many others, that it's just allowing us to go back and explore so much of our
Yes,
history.
so do the text correction as you go.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's really hard to pick up all of the story. It relies on the quality of the OCR and having it fixed. So that's my plug for Trove.
It's right on 1:30-ish, depending which clock I'm looking at. So we might wrap it up there. Thanks, Rachel, for that great presentation, and I will see you all in another session soon. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming, everybody. I appreciate your company today. Bye-bye.